Can you hear me? All right. Okay, I'd like to start with a joke. It's from my 6-year-old. Why didn't the son go to college?
I don't know.
Anyone? Just shout it out.
Why? He was too bright.
Well, I think that's the new response. My daughter says it's because the sun had 360 degrees. Okay. I know, funny. All right. Well, they say with public speaking, you always have to get the crowd into the mood, so I know the food is digesting well. It was a wonderful meal. I want to thank everyone here that invited me to speak, but then also everyone that made this event possible. Brittany Stokes, tremendous leadership, Keon, Eric, everyone. Thank you for making this possible, and each year it seems to get better. I was there at last year's event when Doris Ching spoke, so I feel very honored to be the next batter after Doris, who hit one out of the park, so to speak. So tonight's talk is a journey to discovery, lessons learned from Trayvon Martin and other cases, and avoiding the nostalgia trap. Early on, when Clarissa approached me to give a talk, at that point it was multicultural was the focus, and so I immediately thought of the Trayvon Martin incident, which happened more than 2 years ago, believe it or not, in February. And it was interesting that Keon mentioned at the Ohio State University, he went to a panel on the model minority stereotype, which is one of my lines of inquiry. And so I took great care to prepare for tonight's talk, and I actually made notes because I didn't want to make any mistakes. If it was the model minority stereotype, I could come up here cold turkey and just lecture for, a long time. And I didn't want to do that today. I wanted to honor everyone's time. So I guess I'll begin here. In the Circuit Court of the 18th Judicial Circuit in and for Seminole, Florida, the state of Florida versus George Zimmerman verdict, we, the jury, find the defendant, George Zimmerman, not guilty. An all-woman jury of 6, nearly all of whom were white, read this verdict after their deliberation of the facts that each side presented in the case. The defense, George Zimmerman, and the prosecution, Trayvon Martin. The outcome of the Trayvon Martin case has encouraged substantial discussion about the various ways racial and ethnic minorities are affected by current criminal justice policies. While this discussion should undoubtedly encompass the differential treatment members of the African American community receive, hence, because African Americans have historically been one of the most underserved by the criminal justice policies, tonight I want to argue that this discussion should expand to include other racial ethnic minorities. This evening I want to analyze how Asian Americans are affected by current criminal justice policies compared to their African American peers. What better venue, right? APAC. So, through this analysis, I want to imagine and arrive at important lessons that we all can learn from Trayvon Martin and other cases that involve the murder of Asian American males. Meanwhile, after this discussion, I also hope to persuade everyone in the room to avoid falling for what has been labeled as the nostalgia gap. Let's begin with the case of Trayvon Martin. One of the many tragedies concerning the Trayvon Martin case is that it was not an isolated or even recent event of injustice for the African American community. Similar tragedies have occurred across the nation within the last 2 years, especially in the Deep South and the Midwest of the United States. Here we can see Michael Dunn, a 46-year-old white man who was charged with shooting Jordan Davis, a 17-year-old African-American in Jacksonville, Florida in November of 2012. Notably, much of this Midwestern bloodshed has been neighbor on neighbor, male on male, and white on black murder. I believe this case was, Jordan was in a vehicle with loud music going. In Slinger, Wisconsin, for instance, on March 3rd of 2012, 20-year-old Bo Morrison, an unarmed African-American male, was fatally shot by Adam Kine, a white man with a Colt 45 for allegedly trespassing. Mr. Morrison was taking shelter in Mr. Kine's enclosed porch, apparently hiding from the police since he attended an underage drinking party next door. He was 20. I know this is small, so bear with me, I'll explain what you're looking at here. Wisconsin's Castle Doctrine protected Mr. Kine from being prosecuted under the law since, like stand your ground policies in Florida, self-defense is a reasonable justification for killing your neighbor or friends of your neighbor. And what you're looking at here is a diagram that was published in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and it is a timeline of the tragedy. You have at 1:05 police responding to the complaint. At 1:45, approximately 40 minutes later, after trying without success to get people to exit the garage, police, want to say, we'll make citations in the morning. What you really should point out, though, is from point 4 and 5. Because at point 4, at about 1:55 a.m., Tim Hess tells people in the garage to go out and someone run away. So that image of that detached garage is there and everyone flees. Well, Bo apparently fled to the porch there, the enclosed porch where he was shot by Kind. And then at 2 o'clock, Kind's wife called the police. Another strikingly similar example of a neighbor killing his neighbor occurred on May 31st of 2012, only 3 months after the Trayvon Martin murder in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That's where I did my Ph.D., so a lot of these incidences were around the time of commencement or around the time thereof, graduation. So a lot of these headlines were really seared into my mind. So even reading these words gives me goosebumps. When John Spooner, a 76-year-old white man, fatally shot Darius Simmons, a 13-year-old African-American boy, Mr. Spooner suspected that Mr. Simmons had stolen guns from his home. Like the Bo Morrison murder, Darius Simmons was murdered by his white neighbor. Now, the Trayvon Martin case, as were the two cases I just mentioned, Bo Morrison and Darius Simmons, was fueled by a fear of the other, caused by the habitualization and institutionalization of black adolescents being racialized as violent and criminally minded people. Now at this moment I need to confess, I'm a professor of educational foundations, and the field of foundations really looks at the forces of schools and society, and I really encourage my students to self-question. Certainly question systems, but also question themselves. And it's at this point of time when I really introduce my students to what people call as the super predator, which really came out in 1980, was this idea, right, of black male deviance. And it really was originated in Chicago. Times magazine did a series of stories and newspapers and articles about it, which later they found out was a myth. The super predator did not exist. But it's important because these stories and these incidences are recurring patterns. And if, you've heard the expression, history repeats itself, right? So I think it's important that we don't have historical amnesia here. Processes of habitualization and institutionalization inevitably lead to what Kinchlow, Slattery, and Steinberg in 2000 referred to as sedimented perceptions of people of color. Sedimented perceptions are deeply ingrained subconscious thoughts, behaviors, and actions that people, even well-intentioned people, are unaware of that lead to the stereotyping and marginalization of people of color. The primary way that habitualization and institutionalization are manifested is through American popular culture. With its overwhelming amount of television programs that feature police officers, quote-unquote cops, on the beat, protecting whites and prosecuting people of color. America's 24-hour news and entertainment media cycle, TV shows like Cops, and pseudo-news, I call it, Fox News, also contributes to the public's hegemonic habitualization. Tragically though, as was signaled earlier, in all three cases, Martin, Morrison, and Simmons, the victims were unarmed African male adolescents. We're talking about children. 20 years was the oldest of all of them, right? Also, in all three incidences, the murderer was a white man. Now, some people will scoff and say, well, George Zimmerman certainly was not white. Hear me out. White Hispanic, and we'll get to the point why he was cast as being white in a few moments. The facts speak for themselves. White men have been shooting and killing innocent, unarmed black boys, Martin, Morrison, Simmons, right? They're all under the age of 21, and in most cases, getting away with it. Now, here's the question. Was Trayvon Martin in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or wasn't he? I want to ask an interrelated question of my own to you all. Is there ever a good time to be black in America? I'll give you wait time. I believe, as others have stated, that there is never a good time to be black in America. In fact, poll after poll and study after study all confirm that being black in America is a liability. Hacker, a well-respected political scientist and professor, describes a study featuring a hypothetical scenario in which an individual was incorrectly born as a white person, but would have to return to being an African American. However, as a result of this tragic mistake, the now white, but soon to be black again, individual could seek as much compensation as he or she wanted, based on the cost that he or she believed, right, a change in race would merit. How much compensation would be sought for such a mistake? Any, throw it out. How much money?
20 million.
1 million. So the first person who's at 2 million, you're close. According to Hacker, when this parable has been put to white students, most seem to feel it would not be out of place to ask for 1 million for each future year they would be living as a black American. So I guess that's per year.
Yes.
So much.
20 million.
20 million would be more accurate. There you go. Professor Hacker goes on to say that this calculation conveys, as well as anything, the value that white people place on their own skin. Now, indeed, to be white is to possess a gift whose value can be appreciated only after it has been taken away. Hacker's book, Two Nations, Black and White, Separate, Hostile, Unequal, is powerful testimony for a country that prides itself as being a global beacon for democracy and freedom. But as Ellison wrote in his essay, What America Would Be Like Without Blacks, the fact remains. White Americans have used African Americans in order to define their identity as the normative group. As Ellison states, the fantasy of an America free of blacks is at least as old as the dream of creating a truly democratic society. In fact, Ellison goes on to refer to this mindset or fantasy as our national pathology. So, was Martin in the wrong place at the wrong time? I believe the answer is yes. Zimmerman trailed Martin because of racialized reasoning. Because there were supposedly a recent series of break-ins committed by blacks in the neighborhood that Zimmerman was patrolling, Zimmerman implicitly and biasedly believed that Mr. Martin was suspicious looking and up to no good. It's at this moment that, as a professor, I have my students take implicit association tests that really are a psychological tool that you can go online, just Google Harvard Project Implicit, and you will find them on a host of implicit biases. I've taken it, and yes, the results indicated I was biased. But that should come at no surprise, right? Because, like I said, even though I don't watch cops, there's also other hegemonic socializing agents that I experience and talk to, which I don't watch. I don't even have cable. I have public antenna television, so. Where was I? I argue that Zimmerman was acting on sedimented perceptions. In other words, Zimmerman felt justified to pursue Trayvon, despite dispatchers telling him to stop his pursuit, solely because Mr. Mark was black, and black is associated with criminality in the United States. This leads me to ask perhaps the most simple of questions. Why was Zimmerman so adamant about apprehending Martin? I believe Zimmerman trailed and surveilled young Martin because Martin was racialized as being an outsider of the community, and thus did not belong. In Sanford, Florida's The Retreat at Twin Lakes, the gated community Zimmerman was purportedly protecting. Martin's age, right, he was a teenager, and his race, he was African American, made him an easy target for Zimmerman's racism and eventual murder. Let's return to Bo Morrison and Darius Simmons for a moment. And all of this might seem, where does this fit within Journey? I will clarify that in a moment. A critical analysis of the two Wisconsin cases that were previously highlighted reveals shocking similarities and differences. First, similar to the Martin case, Bo Morrison was wearing black when he was shot by Kind. According to the news and court case documents, Simmons was suspected to have burglarized Spooner's residence. Spooner's suspicion is eerily similar to Zimmerman's suspicion of Martin. It is important to point out the community context where Zimmerman's surveillance occurred. Okay? Context matters. Twin Lakes is a fairly diverse neighborhood, in many ways mirroring the relative diversity of the city in which it is nested, 50% white, 20% Hispanic, and 20% black. These racialized factors across the Wisconsin and Florida cases support the notion that stories like the Trayvon Martin case as a whole are compatible with the narrative America wants, and I'm emphasizing wants and needs to hear. Let me unpack that for a moment. That narrative goes something like this. Black boys are criminally minded, right? That super predator. Deviant and running amok. Contradistinctively, protective, patriotic white men are standing their ground, and in doing so are protecting all of us from imminent and real danger. America needs to hear this narrative in order to reinforce its sense of self. That the United States is a place where people are not maltreated due to their race or ethnicity. I've heard time and time again, we have a black president. We're post-racial. I don't know, ask yourself if you're black in the room, has having a black president changed you being black? I know if we had an Asian Korean president, it certainly wouldn't change my reality as an adoptee, right? So these simple, facile quips, we have to doubt and self-question. Slinger, Wisconsin, let's go back to context. Slinger, Wisconsin, when compared to Sanford, Florida, is very much monoracial. Slinger's population of 5,000 is largely white, 97.2%. In fact, only 0.2% of Slinger's population is African American, according to the 2010 census data that was available. So, right, therefore the narrative of the white man standing their ground happens in diverse areas, Sanford, Florida, and non-diverse areas, Slinger, Wisconsin, of the United States. This last point is incredibly important to identify. The nostalgia trap, something I will address at the end of tonight's talk, implies that things are changing for the worst and things used to be better. This is simply not true. Let's extend the application of this master narrative. And the master narrative is what I've been talking about. I argue that the narrative that America wants and needs to hear, otherwise known as a master narrative, is not exclusively linked to being black in America, but also extends to other racial minorities too, such as Asian Americans, who are considered to be mostly model minorities. In addition to understanding the application of the matching narrative, I believe it's incredibly important to identify Milwaukee, which is, it's true, it's the most segregated city in America. The reality that Simmons' neighbor was white might suggest that racial tensions caused by residential and racial segregation in Milwaukee led to Simmons' murder, or led up to the murder. Segregation of all types, racial, residential, educational, religious, church, and mind you, Dr. Martin Luther King said the most segregated day of the week was what day? Sunday, and he was referring to churches. Exacerbates a fear of the other because it limits interracial and intercultural contact and interaction. What a wonderful event, APAC, that you have. I see so many different faces, different cultures, even the Brazilian woman who did a magnificent job with the song. Beautiful, different languages, multicultural, multilingual, right? Wonderful. However, not all places are as integrated as this space. Segregation also renders structural understandings of deviance, criminality, racism, and inequality invisible, since segregation absolves individuals having to address the biased and racist criminal system, justice system, that maintains this disequilibrium, right? A disequilibrium that leaves black adolescents being blamed, castigated, and racialized as being prone to be violent and criminally minded. In his article, The Political Delinquent, Crime, Deviance, and Resistance in Black America, Gardner in 2004 wisely notes that few acknowledge a dominant group's ability to create deviance merely through its power to define. As Toni Morrison in 2000 famously writes in her novel Beloved, definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. Right? Back to the cops and Fox News. Which is why I want to contextualize our analysis this evening around similar and dissimilar incidences in which we feel race played a pivotal and therefore a consequential role. Right? Tonight I'm arguing that an individual's master status is race when it comes to criminal justice, and that deviance is defined by privileged groups in society, not the reverse. Borrowing from Orr in 2011, when our statuses are defined as having value within the social structure, we experience privilege. If our statuses are devalued, the result is oppression. Now, according to Orr, oppression occurs in three forms. Institutionalized oppression, that which is built into, supported by, and perpetuated by social institutions. Secondly, interpersonal oppression, which simply means, right, that which is manifested between individuals. And thirdly, internalized oppression, that which is directed at oneself. You know, it's so great as an adoptee. I know APAC has some adoptees here. And it is so empowering when you get to know your own story. You know, my father is here somewhere. I don't see up and left, but my biological father, he flew from Korea 2 days ago, and I've met him now a handful of times, and it is so empowering when you get to see, right, your biological father, and not told, right, well, your parents were poor and they gave you up for adoption. So that's simply just an aside, but it's a wonderful space that I hear from adoptees, and it's important to share your stories. Before I continue, Eric or someone, how much time do I have?
Probably another 5 minutes.
Okay, good. You know, they say public speaking is the #1 fear of folk, but professors love to drone on and on, so I'm not nervous, so thank you for listening to me spiel on, be overly loquacious. Let me just go off notes, because I can do that in 5 minutes and kind of unpack where I was envisioning going. There were 2 cases in which Asian Americans were victims, right? They were murdered. Conrad Synthephone, he was a Laotian boy who was murdered by Jeffrey Dahmer in Milwaukee. And Vincent Chin, who was murdered in Detroit. Detroit in the 80s. What's really interesting is if you just Google those two names and do a little research, you see some really miscarriages of justice. One is that the police actually responded to Conorak, Synthephone, and Jeffrey Dahmer was there and actually murdered Conorak after the police came and left. And the reason why the police left is they thought he was gay. So there was overt homophobia present in that case. There was police negligence. The police, the two responding officers were reprimanded. I would say it was a light reprimand. That's one miscarriage of justice, right? That they didn't really have to serve any punishment. In fact, one of the men was voted to be like police sergeant or some big title. And then the Vincent Chin case, which a lot of people in this room know that case, but one thing I believe you don't know a lot or maybe you might, but is less reported, is that prior to him being murdered and trailed and beaten to death with a bat outside of a McDonald's, was that he was at a strip club. He was about to be married. And there are reports, right, of it, how would that look? Asian man in a strip club with possible white women stripping. So all among the time of, right, that the Detroit Motor City was experiencing, Jap bashing and all these notions, right? So I was going to talk about those and then link it, right? So the journey. To me, a journey to discovery, it can mean many things. Journeys imply a destination, and discovery implies learning something or stumbling across something, right? And I think that we can learn lessons from the Trayvon Martin case, Bo Morrison, Mr. Simmons, Conorak, Vincent Chin. We can learn stories about that. But there's one thing that I've learned from studying that history is this. There is a nostalgia trap, and the nostalgia trap goes something like this. It's not like it used to be. Man, where are all these people come? They just need to learn English. This is America. We speak English here. And in a book by a similar title, Stephanie Kuntz writes that, in fact, a nostalgia trap, if you look at evidence, right, it never existed. The whole idea that family values are eroding, divorce is at an all-time high. If you look at the time and length of marriages during pioneer times, they're much shorter than now. Right? And so the nostalgia trap is very dangerous, and I'll be brief because I probably extended over 5 minutes. The nostalgia trap is dangerous for issues of what APAC stands for. I believe, Keon, you said issue for Masu, social justice. I believe that was one of the first words out of your mouth, or one of the other presenters. The nostalgia trap is so dangerous for issues of social justice, for multilingualism, multiculturalism, bilingualism. It seems to me that the things that we're nostalgic for, we're getting better. I would love a nation where everyone is bilingual, right? Being bilingual, speak 2 languages, there's research that shows your brain is much more plastic and much more intelligent if you know 2 languages. The last case I was going to share is this whole notion, this backwardness, and it's going on right now, it's very sexy right now in higher education, is that affirmative action is somehow reverse discrimination. That is a nostalgia trap, because whites, and it's not just from me, it's from people's research and books. Ira Katzlin wrote a nice book on when affirmative action was white. When affirmative action meant white, that was the title of his book. And so, right, inverting victimhood implies something that isn't there. It's a figment of our imagination. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much for listening.